Welcome to our deep dive into the leadership of Angela Merkel. It looks like you've brought a pretty fascinating set of YouTube transcripts about her time as German Chancellor, those 16 years she was in office.
16 years.
It's incredible. And we've got all sorts of stuff here.
Yeah.
Personal stories from people who knew her, some expert analysis of her leadership style, and even breakdowns of major global events where she played a key role. It's a lot to unpack, but I think we're up for the challenge.
It really is remarkable how she managed to maintain that steady hand for so long, especially in a world that often felt anything but stable.
It really does make you wonder. So in this deep dive, we're going to try and figure out what made Merkel such a unique and influential figure. How did her leadership style evolve, and what will her legacy be? Big questions.
Huge.
But that's what we're here for. So to start, let's talk about her journey to becoming chancellor. It's not exactly your typical political trajectory, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, just imagine growing up in East Germany, the daughter of a Protestant pastor who moved the family from West Germany. Talk about a unique perspective.
What an interesting family dynamic that must have been. It makes you wonder, did those early experiences in a totalitarian state influence her later leadership style?
I think it's impossible to say it didn't. There's actually one YouTube video that describes her as someone with no illusions about power and politics. That realism was shaped by her upbringing in East Germany, where caution and carefully calculated actions were essential.
It's like she developed this inbuilt radar for navigating complex situations, almost like a chess player thinking several moves ahead.
I think that's a great analogy, and that methodical approach was only further reinforced by her scientific background.
Oh, right.
She has a doctorate in physics, remember?
Of course.
A far cry from the typical, lawyer-turned-politician path. Many sources actually connect her analytical approach to problem-solving directly to her scientific training.
So she brought this unique blend of East German pragmatism and scientific rigor to the table. But how did she actually get involved in politics? It's not like she was a student activist storming the Berlin Wall or something.
Well, there's this quite funny anecdote, actually. While the Berlin Wall was coming down in 1989, Merkel was, get this, enjoying a sauna.
Really?
Yeah, and then had a beer.
Wow.
So not exactly out there with the protesters.
Definitely not the image that comes to mind when you think of revolutionary moments in history. It does speak to her methodical and grounded approach, though always thinking things through.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean she wasn't engaged. Of course, it was the fall of the Berlin Wall that ultimately spurred her entry into politics. She joined the Demokratischer Aufbruch Party, which was a centrist group focused on practical solutions rather than grand ideological statements. Does that sound familiar?
It's totally in line with what we've been discussing. This practicality seems like a core element of her personality. And actually, even the YouTube videos highlight this anti-flash leadership style of hers. No grandstanding, just getting things done quietly and effectively.
And that's precisely how she quickly rose through the ranks. She caught the eye of Helmut Kohl, the chancellor at the time, who saw her potential. He appointed her to the Ministry for Women and Youth first, and then, even more surprisingly, to the Ministry of the Environment. It was a really rapid ascent for someone considered an outsider.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it? Some of the videos call her Kohl's girl and talk about how the media mocked her appearance. Did those early criticisms shape her in any way?
I think so. Being underestimated and overlooked can be incredibly motivating. It's like she was quietly absorbing everything, learning the political ropes, and building this reputation for competence and reliability, qualities that would prove invaluable later on.
So how did she go from being Kohl's girl to becoming the most powerful woman in the world? These YouTube transcripts must have some clues.
It was really a combination of factors. She was obviously incredibly intelligent, hardworking, and had a knack for staying calm under pressure. But it was actually a political scandal that really launched her career.
Okay, I had to hear this. What happened?
Well, remember the scandal that brought down Helmut Kohl? Illegal campaign donations, accusations of corruption. It really rocked the CDU party. And in a move that surprised everyone, Merkel publicly broke with her mentor.
Wow, that must have been guts. So she wasn't afraid to make tough decisions, even if it meant defying the establishment.
Exactly. It was definitely a calculated risk, but it paid off. She positioned herself as the moral compass of the CDU, and when the party needed new leadership, she was the natural choice.
And from there, her rise was meteoric. Just a few years later, she was elected chancellor in a very tight race against Gerhard Schröder.
That victory in 2005 really signaled a new era for Germany. It showed that the country was ready for change. For a leader who embodied stability and quiet competence, someone who wouldn't shy away from tough decisions.
And that takes us to the heart of her chancellorship. Now that she's in power, how does she actually lead? What happens when the anti-flash approach is put to the test on a global stage? I'm guessing that's where we'll see the real complexities of Merkel's leadership style emerge.
Absolutely, and that's a story for part 2 of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've seen how Merkel's path to power was anything but conventional. But now she's leading a unified Germany in a world that's changing rapidly. So how did her leadership style, shaped by her East German upbringing and scientific mind, play out in the real world? These YouTube transcripts that you gave me have some pretty interesting insights.
Yeah, one thing that really stands out is how she avoided the limelight. No grand speeches or dramatic gestures for her. It was all about meticulous preparation, gathering information, carefully analyzing situations before making a move.
Almost like a slow burn approach, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
But did that methodical approach ever backfire? Especially in a crisis situation where quick decisions are needed.
That's a great question, and one that's definitely debated in these YouTube videos. Some argue that her cautiousness was actually a strength, especially in a world that's so prone to knee-jerk reactions. It allowed her to stay calm under pressure and make really well-informed decisions. Think about those late-night EU summits where she'd just outlast everyone, meticulously reading through documents while others were flagging.
I can almost picture her with a highlighter making notes in the margins. It's such a contrast to the way some leaders operate, shooting from the hip and relying on gut instinct.
Exactly. One of the videos even describes her as having an almost superhuman ability to stay calm in the middle of chaos. Like, remember the 2008 financial crisis? The world was on the verge of a meltdown, but Merkel's response was measured and deliberate.
But weren't there criticism about her being too slow to act? Especially when it came to bailing out those struggling banks and countries.
Oh, absolutely. Some of the YouTube videos definitely highlight that initial hesitation, and some argue that it actually made the situation worse, that her focus on fiscal responsibility, while admirable, was sometimes at odds with the need for quick and decisive action.
So a tension between her pragmatic, fiscally conservative instincts and the demands of a rapidly unfolding crisis. It seems like such a tightrope walk for any leader.
It really is, and that tension played out again during the Eurozone crisis, which followed right on the heels of the financial meltdown. I mean, this wasn't just about banks anymore. This was about the future of the euro itself.
And Merkel was determined to keep the Eurozone together, wasn't she? It seemed like she saw it as a symbol of European unity, something worth fighting for.
I think you're right on that. She believed that a fractured Europe would be a weaker Europe, both economically and politically, but her approach, particularly her insistence on austerity measures for countries like Greece, was met with a lot of resistance. Some of these YouTube videos are actually quite critical of her handling of that whole crisis.
They show those images of Merkel juxtaposed with Hitler, those protests in the streets of Athens. She was accused of being this heartless technocrat, more concerned with numbers than with people's lives.
It was a really difficult position for her to be in. She had to balance the needs of the Eurozone as a whole with the concerns of German taxpayers who were footing a large portion of those bailout bills.
It sounds like an impossible situation. How does she navigate that? What insights do the YouTube videos offer about her decision-making process?
Well, some people argue that she was just too rigid in her approach, that she should have been more flexible in her negotiations with Greece and other struggling countries. Others, though, maintain that her firmness was absolutely necessary to maintain the integrity of the Eurozone and prevent a complete financial collapse. It's a really complex issue with no easy answers.
It sounds like she was trying to walk a very fine line, trying to be both the responsible steward of German resources and the leader of a united Europe. It must have been incredibly challenging.
It certainly was, and it's fascinating to see how her approach to crisis management kind of evolved over time.
Speaking of crisis management, the 2015 refugee crisis was a real turning point for Merkel, don't you think? It seemed like a moment where her pragmatism was tested by a deeply human crisis.
Absolutely. It was a defining moment in her chancellorship, and it revealed a different side to her leadership. Remember, millions of people were fleeing war and persecution in Syria, Afghanistan, and other countries. They were seeking refuge in Europe, and frankly, many countries were really struggling to respond.
And Merkel did something that was pretty unexpected. She opened Germany's borders, declaring Wir schaffen das, we can do this. It was a bold move. Even risky. Did the YouTube videos offer any context for that decision?
They do, yeah. They explore a few factors that seem to influence her thinking. From her own experience growing up in East Germany, where borders represented a barrier to freedom, to her belief in the moral obligation to help those in need.
But that decision was met with a lot of pushback, right? Both domestically and from other European leaders.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Some saw it as reckless, a naive gesture that would just overwhelm Germany's resources and exacerbate social tensions, but others praised her courage and compassion. They saw it as a powerful example of moral leadership, in a time of crisis.
And I'm sure the YouTube videos reflect that range of opinions, right? Some celebrating her humanitarianism, others criticizing her for being too idealistic.
Exactly. The refugee crisis really polarized public opinion, both within Germany and across Europe. It also contributed to the rise of those right-wing populist parties who capitalized on anti-immigrant sentiment.
So it was a decision with both positive and negative consequences, a complex legacy that continues to be debated today. It's interesting how a single decision can have such a ripple effect.
It really highlights the weight of leadership, doesn't it? The responsibility that comes with making choices that impact so many lives. And it also underscores the complexities of governing in a globalized world where challenges often just transcend national borders.
Okay, so we've talked about Merkel's leadership style in the context of these major crises, but what about her relationships with other world leaders? How did her anti-flash approach play out in those interactions? Because, let's be real, she had to deal with some pretty big personalities during her time in office.
You're not kidding. We're talking Putin, Obama, Trump, Xi Jinping, a real mix of personalities and political ideologies. It's fascinating to see how she navigated those relationships, especially given her commitment to multilateralism and diplomacy.
I think that's the perfect segue into the next part of our deep dive. Let's explore those relationships and see how Merkel's leadership style played out on that geopolitical stage. Okay, so let's get into this world of geopolitics now. You've given me some YouTube transcripts that really dive into the details of Merkel's relationships with some pretty big players on the world stage. Putin, Obama, Trump, Xi Jinping. It's quite the lineup. It must have been a real balancing act, especially with her focus on, diplomacy and collaboration. What did you find in these videos about how she approached these relationships?
Well, one of the key takeaways for me was how she was such a master of compartmentalization. She really understood the importance of keeping those relationships strong, even with leaders whose values or actions she may not have agreed with. Take her relationship with Vladimir Putin, for instance.
Ah, Putin. That's a complicated one. I'm sure those YouTube videos have a lot to say about that whole dynamic, right?
They do. It's so interesting to see the different perspectives. Some people actually praise her for keeping those lines of communication open with Putin. They argue it was absolutely crucial for managing tensions and preventing conflict. But then others criticize her for being too accommodating, especially after Russia annexed Crimea back in 2014 and, with their ongoing aggression in Eastern Europe.
It must have been really tricky to try and balance those competing pressures. On the one hand, Germany and Europe rely on Russia for energy. On the other hand, there's this growing concern about Putin's authoritarianism and his disregard for those international norms.
Exactly. And that's where I think Merkel's pragmatism really shines through. She was willing to engage with Putin even when his actions were, clearly reprehensible, because she believed that dialogue, however difficult, was always better than isolation.
So she was playing the long game, trying to keep those lines of communication open, even if it meant, facing criticism for being too cozy with an authoritarian leader.
Right. And that approach wasn't limited to just Putin. She also had to navigate that pretty complex relationship with the United States, especially during the Obama and Trump administrations.
Oh, for sure. I bet the YouTube videos are full of little interesting stories about those relationships.
Oh, there are definitely some good ones. For instance, remember the NSA spying scandal when it was revealed that the U.S. was tapping Merkel's phone?
Oh, yeah?
It was a huge diplomatic incident, and she did not hold back in expressing how angry she was.
I can imagine. That must have been a real blow to trust, especially from a close ally.
Absolutely. But what's really striking is that even after that whole incident, she was able to compartmentalize, to separate her personal feelings from the need to keep a strong transatlantic relationship.
So she could be tough when she needed to be, but she also understood that you can't let a single incident derail that bigger picture.
Exactly. And that ability to compartmentalize, to stay focused on those strategic goals while managing those personal feelings, was also clear in her dealings with Donald Trump.
Oh boy. I bet that was quite a challenge. Trump's whole America First agenda was so different from Merkel's multilateral approach.
It was a real clash of styles. The YouTube videos show her trying to find common ground with Trump, emphasizing those shared values and the importance of international cooperation, but she also pushed back pretty firmly against his more protectionist policies.
It's almost like she was trying to reason with him, appealing to his sense of logic and self-interest, but also standing her ground when necessary.
Yeah, exactly. And it's fascinating to see how she navigated that whole delicate balance. She knew that the U.S.-German relationship was just too important to jeopardize, but she also wasn't afraid to disagree with Trump publicly when she felt it was necessary.
So a mix of diplomacy and firmness, always with that eye on the long-term goals. It's a pattern we've seen throughout her whole career, right?
It really is, and I think it speaks to her consistency as a leader, that ability to adapt to all these different personalities and political contexts, but while always staying true to her own core principles.
Well, after 16 years at the helm, she's definitely left a big mark on the world stage. What do these YouTube videos say about her legacy? What will she ultimately be remembered for?
That is a great question, and one that historians will probably be debating for years to come. The videos offer all kinds of perspectives. Some people hail her as this champion of liberal democracy, a steady hand who guided Germany and Europe through really turbulent times. They point to her handling of multiple crises, her commitment to multilateralism, and her unwavering defense of human rights.
Those are some pretty big accomplishments.
They are, but the videos also acknowledge that her legacy is complex and, multifaceted. Some criticize her for being too cautious, for not having this bold vision for the future. They point to things like the rise of right-wing populism in Germany and Europe, the challenges posed by climate change, and that growing economic inequality as issues that she could have maybe addressed more forcefully.
It sounds like a real mixed bag, a blend of successes and shortcomings, just like any leader who's held power for that long. It really makes you think about those immense challenges of leading a nation or even a continent in a world that just never stops changing.
It really does, and maybe that's the most important takeaway from this whole deep dive. Leadership is messy, it's complex, and there are rarely any easy answers. Merkel's story is a reminder that even the most successful leaders have their flaws and make mistakes. But it's also a testament to the power of pragmatism, perseverance, and a deep commitment to serving that common good.
I like that. It's been really fascinating exploring the leadership of Angela Merkel. It seems like she's left a lasting impact, for better or worse, on Germany, Europe, and the world.
I think you're right, and it'll be interesting to see how her legacy evolves in the years to come. Who knows, maybe she'll even pop up somewhere and offer her own reflections on her time in office.
That would be quite the podcast. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking.